the more that you can understand what it is, who you are as a human being, and what it is that you're looking for, and what's important to you, and how that feeds into an emotionality of change for you. I think that that can be incredibly helpful. That's difficult to do in the moment. I think that the more people that you have who you can really rely on within that process, the better. I mean, I talked about earlier my friends who also will stop. You should stop. You need to compromise. Your bar is too high. But I knew, even though they said that, I knew that's not really what they meant, right? What they really meant was, we got your back, keep going. We're going to be here no matter what. We're going to make fun of you. We're going to do this, we're going to do that, but we're always going to be here nonetheless for you. My father, my stepmother, they were much more hands-on because they know me so well. And they were able to really, as I said, help me to focus in that lens of what it was that I really needed to look at more clearly. Um, those are the sorts of things that I don't think there's any magic around it, though. I guess that's it. There's just no real magic. I think it's just something you have to live through and not struggle with it. The more you struggle with it, the worse it gets, because it gets tighter and tighter the more you struggle with it.
In this true love story, I talk with Eric Isselhardt, and he is a senior executive with over 35 years of leadership experience in the educational arena, both for profit and nonprofit. His story of meeting his beloved and the 12 years leading up to it is so full of depth, vulnerability, and wisdom. The insights that he gathered in becoming the person that he became in order to be ready, as he puts it, for he and Dawn to meet and fall in love. So I think you'll enjoy and learn some things that might apply to you. I just love talking about love, and this is a rich one. So enjoy. Well, all right, Eric, I can't wait to hear your side of the story.
Great.
But we do know that you spent 20 years ready for finding a partner. So
That's right.
yeah. I'm curious about that. Let's start there, and then maybe we'll back up in time, and I'll hear even more of your love story.
Sure.
Yeah.
Sure. So you want to hear a little bit more about those 12 years of search, is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah, searching the wasteland and trying to find everything. I mean, it was, true Eliot inspired, I think. Well, look, I think that it was a long journey of 12 years. And at points, I really lost real hope, actually, and was uh, really kind of depressed that I wasn't going to find someone, because I really had decided, I've been married twice before, and had decided that I was not going to compromise what I thought about what a relationship was all about, that I was really going to lean into the whole notion of a true partnership, that I wanted someone who was at least as strong as I felt like I was, and had was able to articulate that in a meaningful sort of way in whatever languages of love that they chose, but that there was an evidence of that at all times. Um, I think that, I went through some really bizarre experiences during those 12 years. I was online, I did the whole online dating scene, and I had two fascinating, really almost illustrative, almost apocryphal sorts of stories around it. One was that I went to a first date, and I quickly got to the point where I realized I was interviewing instead of kind of, the first date is all about, is there going to be a second date? That's really all you should be worried about. That's all you should be concerned about. That's all it is, right? And I started off, though, and I was very much kind of interviewing for the right person, and that's no good for either me or for her. And so I quickly got to a point where I was not doing that so much, and I also got to a point where I wasn't doing kind of lavish first dates either. I started out, doing kind of, we're going to have an experience together. We're going to go ropes climbing. We're going to do this. We're going to do that, whatever it may be. And if the real purpose of the first date is to find out if there's a second, in my mind, the best way to do that is to facilitate a real conversation with each other.
Right.
And that, yeah, and that's the expectation is, can we have a conversation about who we are authentically with each other?
I would love for us to pause for a minute and talk about the difference between interviewing and having a connection, a conversation, bringing more empathy maybe to the experience. How did you make
Yeah.
the shift, and then how did you conduct those get to know each other first dates?
Yeah, so for me, and everybody comes to these points from their own perspective, of course, but for me, it was an interview process because I am at core very much of an introvert. I was then very shy. And even to this day, I'll tell you, I've never asked a woman out. It's always been, she's always asked me out first because I just don't, that's just how it is. And people in my professional life just laugh at me about that because, I do all these things that would imply otherwise to that. But nonetheless, that was how it was. And so I actually had a list of questions. I can't get more interviewee than that, right? So, I did the online and we would meet and I had a list of questions and it got to where I didn't have to have them written in front of me after a while, but in the beginning, I actually had written questions. But, to your point, then what I realized through that process was that I wasn't meeting well I'm sure I was meeting wonderful humans. I'm sure I was that, no question of that. At the same time though, I'm not convinced, and I know for a fact that that interview process where I have pointed questions, and sometimes it was the other way back towards me too, by the way, where they were interviewing me as well, so it was a very much of a transactional sort of an experience. But we never got to the authentic self. We never really got to, even in a first encounter, I think that you can get to a place where you have at least a sensibility of who this other person is. I think that you can reach an understanding of, is there something there that I can relate to enough that I want to really spend some time and effort in getting to know this person further?
What I'm hearing, sensibility, is to
Yeah,
actually bring in the sense, the sensation, the energy
yeah,
exchange, the comfort. How
that's
do you
right.
feel with that person? Is it
That's
an
right.
easygoing conversation? So you
Yeah.
learn to leave some of the interview questions for maybe date 2 or 3, a little bit more casual, not so
What I learned was to abandon them completely.
good for you. I
That it
love
was
that.
doing me that it was doing me no service whatsoever. Actually, right?
Mhm.
That I think kind of on the edge underneath what you just said is that those things are going to come out anyway, right? If you're just kind of being yourself with someone and interacting with them and really trying to kind of feel what that's all about, then the interview sorts of questions are going to occur. That's going to come out through the experience and the conversation. So I learned very quickly to that just to toss them out completely.
And then you said you also moved from these extravagant adventure first dates, which
Yeah,
also are costly. It's an investment
there.
of time
Yeah.
and
Oh
money.
yeah,
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 yeah.
yeah. But I want to say one last thing about the interview versus not thing though, which is for me very personal to me around this is that what that implied. I think that it takes a little bit of courage to do that from my side of the dating table to abandon the list of questions because what that meant was that I had to have a little more confidence in who I was and allow that to emerge and show that vulnerability in a way that the interview question set was masking. And in order to do that required really for me to take a bigger risk and to be willing to let that risk take me wherever it went along the journey. That's a huge shift in paradigm when I in my dating life when I made that shift away out of the interview, which was really a protection for me more than anything else, and into taking the risk of being more open to what was going to happen.
And that's what we're talking about. It's like to go from rehearsed, a script, questions to actually just dropping it and being
That's
willing
right.
to be your authentic self with someone and see how.
Yeah.
What I tend to encourage people, and what I did for myself as I was navigating finding my beloved, how do
Yeah.
I feel when I'm with him? And can I be
Mhm.
most true self, all of me? because I
That's right.
realized in my two previous long-term relationships, so we have that
Yeah.
in common, that I had started off a little bit on the wrong foot in the sense that I
Mhm.
was being what I thought they wanted me to be.
Oh,
And
yeah,
so then I set that precedent for myself. And so I knew in
yeah.
this relationship, this third time around, I am
Sure.
committed to being totally myself. Can I be myself?
Yeah,
So when you did meet Don,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
let's jump there for a moment.
Okay.
What happened?
Well, the first time I met Dawn, I didn't like her. It was on a phone call, and she was trying to sell me something that I didn't want to buy. It was very much of a professional call that she was making with me. We had a mutual friend, and he has suggested that she contact me about some business that she wanted to be doing. And we're both nonprofit leaders. And at the time, I actually was in a for-profit environment, but all about education, though. And she wanted to sell me something, and I just didn't want to talk to her and didn't really the timing wasn't right. I wasn't looking for anybody. I don't think she was particularly either, but that was the first time that we met. Right. The second time I think about a year later. So I am very logistically challenged. So to me, I leave, dates and time is really a Dawn thing, not an Eric thing. So I think it was about a year later where we actually had our first Zoom conversation where we saw each other face to face, where we had more of a conversation. But even that was, she still was trying to see if my company wanted to do something with her company. And, and the individual who kind of set us up, he had ulterior motives of his own that we would get together, even though I was on the East Coast and she was on the West Coast. And again, the timing just wasn't quite right for either one of us. We were really I think both of us would agree we were in our own lives, or on the cusp of it being the right time, but not quite really there. And, and the fact that she was long distance never works. I laugh about that because, of course, in our case, it totally worked. Right. So I can't say that anymore. But, there was that barrier in place. And because it wasn't really the right moment for that to happen, then I allowed that barrier to rule. And so we didn't connect again. And then it was I think probably another year or so later, where finally the timing was just right, and timing was right for her. And I know you've heard her part of that story. And the next time that we connected with Zoom, it was there was a pretext of business around it, but we both sort of knew that this was much more like a first date would be. But because of Zoom sort of a thing, then that just put a different sort of feel and spin to it.
Wow. So you weren't ready. It had been 12
No.
years in, but you weren't ready. Was that just because you got discouraged? You had said you had been kind of hoping.
Yeah. During those 12 years, there were periods of time where I did have a serious relationship along the way, a year or 2 or 3 year relationships along the way. So it wasn't as if I wasn't seeing anybody along the way. But at the same time, I think that, I had reached a point towards the end of those 12 years where I had just lost any faith that what I was looking for was what I was going to find. All my friends said, Eric, your standards are too high. You know, you can't expect to find someone who is educated, who is connected to who they are as a human being, who is, all these different kinds of qualities. Not a list, Joy. I don't want to, it definitely was not a list. I don't think that was the case, but just different qualities that I would respond to. Um, and really, ultimately, I think at core, sort of looking for the same thing, that degree of partnership that, you said yourself, that in your earlier time that, you made the mistake, as I think it's a common mistake that many women and some men make, to want to try to be what they think the other person wants them to be. And I was definitely not looking for that at all. I just wasn't looking for that. And I really wanted someone who was going to, who is at the same place of being willing to take the same sorts of relational risks that I was at that point. That's a harmony that is hard to come to, right? And it's hardly ever one-to-one correspondence, and it wasn't with Dawn and I. But at the same time, it was close enough that we could feel what that would feel like if we in fact pursued it even further. And that was unique. That was very unique.
Talk to me about some of these relationship risks that you were willing to take, and she was too. It made it work for you.
Yeah, it's everything from the prosaic to the poetic. So on the more kind of practical level, is just, look, she was on the on the West Coast, I'm on the East Coast. So the risk is that we're going to put up some time into this, and because of this distance, we're not going to actually physically meet for it could be a while. And that's kind of a risk. From my perspective, the whole physical attraction is, that was an important thing to me at the time. And I said, okay, well, I'm going to set that aside. I'm going to let that go. Right. And the risk is that when we finally do meet, that there's not kind of the chemistry attraction, then I'll have wasted all this time in the relational part of it. In the end, that was a strength. In the end, what I thought was a risk actually was a really wicked smart move because it allowed us to really find out, who we were as human beings, from an emotional, psycho-emotional level versus the physical level, and that was magical in the end, actually.
I agree. And I talk about this a lot because that
Yeah,
long distance does take out the equation of the physical and jumping into
yeah,
sexual intimacy. Maybe
yeah.
maturely, you get to really see how you are as friends
That's
or
right.
spiritual allies. Okay, so that was one risk
Yeah,
is okay, it's long distance.
right,
What about
right.
some of the emotional or vulnerable risks on your Zoom calls?
Yeah. So again, you have to put it in the context of the artificiality of the Zoom relationship, right? There's a context there out of which you really just can't step just by the nature of the design of the form, right? So it just is what it is. But nonetheless, when you think about the risk then of intimacy, it's not obviously just physical intimacy, but there's an emotional intimacy, right? So what are you willing to share of yourself, both in terms of your personal story that you might not be so comfortable with, or also just your own vulnerabilities in relationships. And that has to do with the failures that you've had in prior relationships. That has to do with, what your hopes and dreams are and why those are now hopes and dreams. And so the risk is being open to those levels of conversation and discussion in this kind of artificial environment. And I do think that the artificial environment of Zoom mediates the risk a little bit, right? Because at any moment I can push a button and you go away. Right? I have that power if I want to use it, right? So it is a little bit of an artificial risk, but it still is a risk that I'm saying to her, I'm going to trust you with this. And I'm going to, even though we have this kind of, I can't look you deeply in the eyes while I'm sharing this with you, I'm still going to share it with you and see where this goes and how you respond to it. Um, it only really works, I think, if the other person is willing to do that too. It
And
has to
that's
be.
what you were talking about, that you
Right.
wanted to meet someone who was
That's
willing
right.
to take the same risks. And
Exactly.
earlier, you said someone who was as strong as you.
That's right.
What do you mean by strong as you? In what ways? What ways
Well,
is Dawn meeting you at that depth?
so, I had it rough coming up. I grew up in a very, rough, difficult time. My mother was absent most of the time, single mom. I had brothers and sisters. My youngest brother, I practically raised. I mean, there were just lots of difficulties along the way. And very early on, I had to decide who I wanted to be and what kind of human being did I want to really project, and how was that going to kind of inform the decisions that I made along the way in my life. That takes a certain strength of will, really, to kind of work through that. And I think many people who come through trauma, they get crushed by that trauma, but there's some who use that trauma as a lever to build into something that's a strength. And it can be a strength as long as it doesn't become armor. If it's armor, and that's another way that people deal with trauma, is to create that armor, then that's, to me, that's not a strength. So you have to have that kind of sensibility of who you are and really what life really means to you. And that's when I talk about, as strong as I am, that's really what I was looking for. Dawn in spades has that. In fact, much more than I have. I mean, there's few people I know that know themselves as well as she does, and has such a North Star for the sort of human being that she wants to be. It's incredibly admirable, and someday I might get there. But it's just impressive. But finding someone who has that degree, that was it. And it's funny because I say someone who has that much. Well, the thing about Dawn is she has in almost all cases more than I have. So it's like I always say I wake up every morning and she's still there. I say, wow, that's amazing that she's still there.
Oh, she's pretty smitten. She loves you so much. She's so happy. And it's so beautiful how you brought your lives together. But you're exhibiting emotional maturity. It
Sure.
feels to me the willingness to share your emotions, to share your past, to like really get
Yeah.
to know her and put down the guard and become the man that you are and
Right.
continuing to become in the relationship clearly,
Yeah.
and I love
Yeah.
that.
And that was I didn't start there in the journey, right? You were talking about this 12 years. I came to that through the process of those 12 years. And there was a point, and I think it's like, being an alcoholic, you reach that bottom, the bottom floor, and that's where the right time to build up. And I think that I had hit that floor. And my father, Ted Matthews, is a man who raised me. And he taught me just about everything I know about relationships. And there was a time about 10 years in where I went home, and my stepmother is equally brilliant in just these sorts of things. And I was there for a couple of days, and I went there kind of broken and really had just come out of this relationship. I put a lot of time and energy and compassion into, and it just wasn't what I was hoping it would be. And he kind of rebuilt me, and I don't want to, I don't want to minimize the work that my stepmother did, but the two of them really rebuilt kind of my sensibilities, and building on the prior 10 years of experience, we all kind of came to this, what we're talking about now. And that this is really what I needed to be focusing on, was these sorts of ways of searching, really, and searching with myself out there ahead of it, and so searching for someone who could join that in that line ahead. That was kind of the secret of it all. And my
Well,
my father really helped me to see how that worked.
I mean, I'm just got courage, and bravery because to leave relationships because they weren't
Yeah.
meeting the standards of what you wanted after you had invested energy, time, resources
That's
into
right.
them. I know that can be
Yeah.
difficult for a lot of people in the dating process. And then you
Yeah.
reached out and you had some allies
That's
in
right.
to
That's
rebuild
right.
you to what you talked about earlier, which
Yeah.
was the high standards.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I don't, and I'm sure eventually I would have come to that eventually. But, I mean, I say that, but of course, 12 years later, I mean, that's how long it took. Right. But, I think that, working, my father, my stepmother, really having kind of hit that, having had all the pieces swirling, but not really very well focused on how a relationship would work for me and what that really meant. And then to help have them provide that lens that I could then use to focus through, that was, that made all the difference.
And they have a beautiful relationship, so they could model that and speak from
They did.
experience.
Yeah, yeah. My father just recently passed last year, but yeah, absolutely. I mean, their love affair, it's just everything that you can imagine that is beautiful in life. They embody that. Yeah.
Well, and so that's really important too. I find
Yeah.
that the more that we can find the role models of relationships that are healthy, then
Yeah.
of course that's what we want.
That's right.
It's
That's
like
right.
it doesn't have to be dysfunctional. It can
Right.
actually support us in becoming our highest potential.
That's right. And it works in the converse, unfortunately, too. And that was my experience, growing up with a very dysfunctional mother, and really just trying to figure it all out on my own. That was, I think, part of what kind of created more of the swirl.
Right. And so you
Yeah.
said you became who you became in those 12 years. Is there anything you want to add to that, those 12 years? Like, how did that shape you to support you in being ready for the love you have now?
um, No, I don't think so, Joy. I think that, I guess that there were so many lessons learned along the way with that process. And, it was one of the things I had to learn was that it's not just about how ready I am, but how ready she is. Right. I mean, literally, and Dawn would say the same thing, literally 3 months on either side of when we did that first momentous actual Zoom where we actually really did end up talking with each other. But 3 months on either side of that, I don't know that it would have actually worked. I just don't know. I mean, before that, I was in a little bit of a relationship. After that, she might have been in a relationship herself. Who knows, right? But the timing of it all and that was absolutely critical.
Mm. And now that you guys have been together, how long?
5 years.
5 years.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. How did it really click? And talk a little bit about when you did get to see each other in person, how that went.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's just, I feel silly and awkward just talking about it because, by then it just seemed like, oh, yeah, here's my best friend. Okay, great. And of course we're having this wonderful conversation. And of course we're doing this. And of course we're doing that. And of course the intimacy is wonderful and spectacular. And of course, all those things are coming together because by then, we had gone down already the emotional intimacy road so far that the rest really was just, you know, that's it. I mean, I'm kind of an introvert, and in some ways, I'm not going to say I'm antisocial because I work in the real world and I work with people, but there aren't a lot of people that I want to spend a lot of time with. And really, it's only one, and that's Dawn. I mean, certainly my daughter. I love spending time with my daughter, but Dawn, anywhere, anytime, let's go.
So, in addition to the emotional connection you guys have
Yeah,
and the intimacy you spoke of, as the
yeah.
best friends and activities, what is it like being with your best friend and calling her your wife? What do you guys do together? What are you enjoying?
Yeah, so it's a funny sort of a question because much of the time we don't do anything, right? I'll be reading, she'll be reading. I'm a crossword fanatic. I'll be busy at work on crosswords, and she'll be reading something for work or whatever, right? And we'll kind of look up at each other, be a couple hours later, say, "Hey, good day, right? Yeah, very wonderful day."
I love that.
Right. And then we also, though, truly believe in our own time. Right. And that's an important part of our relationship where, I definitely need time where because I'm not the extrovert, then I definitely need time where I just have my own recharge time where I'm only, I'm just by myself doing something, whatever that may be. She needs that time too, but less so than I do. And so we just recognize that, and there's never a question about it, just never a question about it. I think that where we have really worked through some of the tough things had to do with the things in our historical lives that were triggering for us, right? That we really had to work through. So, for example, um, most couples, finances can be something really destructive in a relationship. And for us, for both of us in our own unique ways, any kind of sign of issue or trouble or controversy around that is triggering for us. So one of the things that we do so well together that I really think comes out of that fundamental base is problem solving together and really being able to say to each other, okay, I see you're triggered by this. Let's kind of take a deep breath. Let's kind of work through it rather than going to our corners around it. And it's not to say that we've never had an argument, but I will say that we've never had an argument. It's more the point of, we have what might look like difficult conversations together, but inside they're not difficult because there's not fear attached to the conversation with each other. We know inherently that no matter how difficult, whatever it is that we need to be talking about, whatever we have to approach, that there's no reason to fear from the other person, that the other person we always assume that the other person has our best interest in their heart and mind. And if you can begin from that point, then the rest becomes just the detail of it all, and the fear can be let go. And if you let go of that fear, then everything else becomes possible.
Beautiful. Yeah. And these relationship skills, did they come through your own personal observation? How have you grown as an individual in relationship? What have been your tools and resources?
Yeah, so my early tools and resources was dysfunction. Right. And I think too often, we learn about relationships through in the absence of the coping tools that we need to have successful relationships. And so we end up, that's why the whole notion of psychology and reflectivity around things becomes so important, because you have to reflect on your failures. And that's really the absence of those successes. And I, like most people, had to work through the absence of that, which it looks a lot like dysfunction and chaos. So recognizing that in myself early on, though, I had to really begin to say, yeah, I had to be very cold with myself and say, is this who I want to be? Is this really forget about the relational aspect of it. Forget about any of that. Just as a human being sitting with myself, is that something that I'm comfortable being as that human being? And so I've always had that sort of sensibility from a very young age. That's kind of how I look at things. And so I kind of built out from there. So I think, tools along the way, as I recognized then that I was really working with the absence of those tools, then I actively started seeking out those things in a more proactive, positive way, in a way to kind of make sure that they were there. Dawn, I think, went through a very similar sort of process, actually. I think she would describe it very similarly, actually. And it just so happens that the tools that we have individually are much the same that we have together, and each of us has tools that the other has developed that the other one does not. And so I think that's the complementary aspect of it all.
It's so wonderful, isn't it? What we can learn from our partners
Oh,
and
it's amazing. Yeah.
yeah.
No, it's amazing. Yeah. No,
And
I
then
mean,
it
it's
just
phenomenal.
continues to be this, like we talked about, bringing out our best potential, growing
That's right.
spiritually, emotionally, psychologically.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I'm gonna ask a question for people who are listening to our conversation, who
Sure.
are in the seeking or the desiring or the prayer of wanting a partner. And I want to
Yeah.
specifically for ones that are feeling a little hopeless, because you use that word.
Yeah.
What
Yeah.
would you what would be some of your recommendations?
But that is so hard without knowing who a person is, in front of me, and to really kind of talk to them. It's a hard thing to generalize about something like that. I think that there's a couple different layers that I would look to, though, no matter what. One is that sense of hopelessness is real. And the more you fight that sense of hopelessness, the less you're going to learn from it, and the less you're going to be able to work out of it. So I always ask people to embrace that hopelessness, not to wallow in it. There's a big difference between embracing it and trying to really go deeper into it, leaning into it, versus just allowing it to control you and allowing that feeling to take precedence over anything else. And I'm separating out, by the way, any real depression issues and things like that, because that's a whole separate thing that we're not talking about right now. That sense of hopelessness around love and finding the right person, that's really what I'm looking at now. So embracing it, really leaning into it, letting yourself feel that way. And then, though, coming to terms with it and just saying, okay, I'm going to feel the same way I am now, 5 days, 5 weeks, 5 months from now. And if I don't do anything now, it's still going to be the same within those timeframes. So why not start looking outward beyond that when you're ready to do that? And so I think that the sooner that you can look outward again, the better off you can be. I think that you know I think it's a little too trite to say there's someone out there for everyone. I just don't believe that. I think people can say that, and you can also say that there are lots of people out there for you. I mean, I just don't find it very helpful. I think to someone who's hopeless and really worried about that hopelessness, that the more that you can understand what it is, who you are as a human being, and what it is that you're looking for, and what's important to you, and how that feeds into an emotionality of change for you, I think that that can be incredibly helpful. That's difficult to do in the moment. I think that the more people that you have who you can really rely on within that process, the better. I mean, I talked about earlier my friends who also will stop. You should stop. You need to compromise. Your bar is too high. But I knew, even though they said that, I knew that's not really what they meant, right? What they really meant was, we got your back, keep going. We're going to be here no matter what. We're going to make fun of you. We're going to do this, we're going to do that, but we're always going to be here nonetheless for you. My father, my stepmother, they were much more hands-on because they know me so well. And they were able to really, as I said, help me to focus in that lens of what it was that I really needed to look at more clearly. Um, those are the sorts of things that I don't think there's any magic around it, though. I guess that's it. There's just no real magic. I think it's just something you have to live through and not struggle with it. The more you struggle with it, the worse it gets because it gets tighter and tighter the more you struggle with it.
Yeah, you're
Yeah.
so speaking. I loved your distinction between letting the hopelessness guide you, lead you,
Yeah.
take over your
Yeah.
thoughts, tell you
Yeah.
stories that aren't
That's
true.
right.
But
That's
at the
right.
same time, you're not fighting it and shutting it
Right.
up. You're actually
Right.
embracing it with some maturity, with some love, with
That's right.
acceptance. That's what I heard you
Yeah.
say. And I'm just
Yeah.
reiterating because it's just such a clean distinction. Then you said, then take a step when you're ready outward. What
Right.
would be some of the outward steps that people can take that are ready for love or feel ready?
Yeah. So hopefully, if you're ready to make that step, what that means then is that you've come out of that phase of that real sadness and hopeless feeling because you have recognized in yourself your value and your self-worth, right? Because I really think that hopelessness its roots come out of no one's going to love me. I can't find anyone. I'm going to be alone the rest of my life. Those are all very kind of sad kind of moments that come out of, and they always talk about self-pity. I don't think it's pity, actually. I think that what it is this lack of confidence in who you are. And so if you're ready, what that means then is that you have embraced who you are again, or at all, or in the first place, if that's the case too, and you have a confidence about that, that then will be an attractive sort of a force in the world. Right. So there's that part of it. And then you just have to be in places where that force can be recognized.
Well said. Well said. You got to go out of your living room.
Right.
Yeah.
That's right. And that's different for everybody, what that means. Right. I mean, it really depends on who you are and what your interests are. Yeah.
Yeah, who you are and what your interests are, and follow those. What the interests
Mhm.
are, get out, be there.
That's
If
right.
it's a retreat, if it's traveling, if it's online, which you did,
That's right.
or
Whatever. Yeah.
Dawn shared in her story, she reached out
Yeah.
to a lot of friends and said, "Okay, I'm
Yes.
ready. Who can you introduce me to?" That's
That's
big.
right.
Yeah.
That's right. Absolutely. Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And so the mutual friend that you both had
Yes.
said, give it one more try. So I'm curious, this is probably the last question, but when
Okay.
you, Dawn, got on that Zoom and there was a little bit of professional talk, but you both had a feeling that there was more to it than that.
Right.
Was that
Yes.
because the friend said something, or was that because you each just had a feeling about it? And how did you make that transition from business speak to more intimate speak?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a good answer to that. I mean, to me, it's a little bit of magic, actually. I think that, I mean, he didn't say anything to me, but I know that he spoke to Don, and I know that he and his wife were at dinner with Don, and Don said, I'm so ready. I've been on these dates. There's nothing, what should I be doing? And he said, well, I already told you somebody who you need to meet, which was me. And she said, well, he's far away across the country. And he said, well, you're a world traveler, Don. That shouldn't be any issue. That shouldn't be a barrier for you. And she said, huh, yeah, that's right. So I think she came to that next meeting sort of ready, right? I came to that next meeting not because of anything that Joseph had said to me, but because I had pretty, like, maybe a few weeks before, had ended a relationship that just proved itself to be so completely wrong. And I just was saying, okay, and since I'd gone through all those points along the way, I was able to look at that about why and what had happened there. So I was ready. So I think that it was just one of those things where, the confluence of our lives were just at the point where a spark could be shared. And that took a little bit of time to get to.
I love your love story.
So do I.
And it continues and it's sweet. And you two are just so happy. It's just apparent.
Joe, well, I appreciate that so much. But, Joey, one of the things that I think is important about that, though, is that we talk about it all the time. 5 years later, we still talk about it, our story and what the 5 years along the way continues to add to that story. Right. So for us, it's this, she's a, at heart, she's a literature professor, comparative literature professor. I appreciate that very much too. And I think that we just look at it as this epic bit of literature that we continue to add to. So that means that we want to talk about it. We go back in time with it. We go forward in time with it. We think ahead about it as if it were this epic novel that we had written together. And, building that into the future is just something that we love to talk about what that means.
Oh my goodness. Just give me a little tidbit of the courtship.
The courtship?
Oh, well, so you were having conversations online. You
Oh,
chose
oh,
to
oh,
come
yeah.
together. I mean, how did you romance each other? What was the courtship phase before it
Sure.
went right into commitment?
Yeah, so that took a little while. I mean, we moved quickly once we knew that we felt the right thing was right. But I will say that, we started Zooming pretty quickly every night. That was important. I would send her sort of romantic, texts along the way, just, there's things I was thinking about at the time, talking a lot like we're talking right now, in terms of just kind of what that looked like, or if I came across some bit of particular poetry or some bit of literature that I really loved, and I share that with her, and she would do the same. So we sort of had this ongoing dialogue that was both through Zoom, but also through social media on texting. That all kind of progressed, and it's funny because Dawn was living with two of her kids at the time, and talks about how she would come home and she'd lock herself in her room, and eventually she came and said, "Oh, I've seen this man now," and they said, "Well, it's been obvious for months now, Mom." I love that. I love that part of the story. Um, but yeah, we would just have this ongoing conversation, very much like you and I are doing now, but in obviously a much more intense sort of way. And I think that ultimately we both also came to the point where we said, okay, now we really want to meet each other in real life. And and that was a little bit of a challenge because yeah, we wanted to meet someplace that neither of us had been before. And I've been really nowhere. I mean, figuratively speaking. Dawn, however, has been everywhere. I mean, she's lived all over the world, all over the United States. She's traveled. Her work took her all over, so she's been everywhere. So we finally decided that Savannah, Georgia, that neither of us have been to Savannah, and that's where we meet, and that's what happened.
I'm so glad I asked because I can feel how sweet to romance each other with the literature and the poetry and to speak
Right.
that language. And
Right.
Gavin and I did the same thing. We did voice memos with each other, and we
Oh,
were
nice.
being these long, very luscious, very vulnerable, back to that
Yeah.
word, just overtures of
Oh,
care
yeah.
and
Yeah.
kindness. And
Yeah.
so I'm glad I asked. That's so beautiful. And that's a risk too. Talk
Oh,
about
yeah.
relationship risks. Yeah.
Yeah. But the beauty of that, as you know from your own experience, is that, yes, but what always shocks me is the things that we think are the biggest risks, once we're in it and we built into it, become our greatest superpowers with each other.
Mm.
Right. And so the risk disappears. It's not a risk. You could say, yeah, well, it is a risk because now Dawn knows me better than anybody in the universe has ever known me. And that's a power over somebody in a dark world, right? That could be a power over somebody. And I suppose there's that risk. But without that letting go and that completely allowing that to occur, nothing else happens. And you have to lean into that. And yeah, it begins with a risk, but it ends with something much greater than that.
Well, and the more comfortable we are with ourselves and the
Yeah,
more at peace, and you spoke to
yeah,
this, we are with ourselves, it's being transparent
that's
and
right.
being that intimate becomes very natural.
That's right. Your authentic self and being able to be your authentic self. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
yeah. And that's
yeah,
really what we're after. But it does
yeah.
start with self. And it sounds like you
Right.
hit your rock
Absolutely.
bottom and you
Yes,
said, okay, it's time to be real and honest with
that's
myself
right.
and trust yourself and then trust on.
That's
Yeah.
right. That's
Yeah.
right. Totally. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, congratulations and happy anniversary coming up in a couple
Thanks.
weeks.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I appreciate that.
This has been a blast. I really do appreciate you sharing so much, Eric.
Sure.
Really, so much wisdom and life experience.
Well, I don't know about that, but you know, it is what it is in that regard. Yeah.
One thing that comes up a lot, Eric, is
Yeah.
I hear women say there aren't any good men out there, or all the good men are taken. And to that, what might you say?
Well, first of all, I would quibble the issue and say that there actually are lots of good men out there. I know quite a few of them myself, but there are a couple things I would add to that. One is that I have a theory, and it's just a theory. There's no science behind it. That boys don't become men until their mid 40s, and sometimes they never do. Okay. I know for myself, it took me to my 50s to become a man in the way that we've been talking about what it means to be a man, and particularly a man in a relationship. So it just takes time, I think, for boys to become mature adult men. I do think that that is it. I don't think, though, that there's a relative shortage of that. I think rather there's a sense out there that, there's always there's only one. There's only this one out there. But you know what? For me, I've always had this other weird kind of other way of looking at it where there's many more women out there. There's lots of wonderful women out there. And if you think of that, that's the thing, but I'm choosing this one. This is who I'm choosing right now. This is who I think is my life partner. This is one I am actually choosing. And choosing from, though, this perspective that we've been talking about what a relationship should mean to all of us and to each other in particular, what that's all about. That implies then that it doesn't matter how many are out there. It really doesn't matter. That's not the point, actually, right? The point is that when you find the one that is you're making that connection with, that you actually do then lean into that connection. I think that it's easy, and it can be part of that depression, that hopeless feeling that there's no one out there for me. But again, if you're starting from that, that's kind of that's the obverse, I think, that's going to lead somebody to success. I think where I try to begin, and I'm not perfect at this. Please I'm not saying myself as any sort of example of this, but the closer I got to feeling like it was more about me as a human being and what I thought relationships should be like, and less about finding the perfect one. The magic of that was that the perfect one emerged from that, right? It happened that way. Rather than my searching out for that person with this set of criteria, it really began with who I am as a human being and what I find, what to me is important in a relationship. And really understanding that in a significant sort of a way, that's a different view than searching for this list of someone who, there's someone who has this list of criteria. And what I found was then that the whole notion of only one, or there's so few women out there, or so few men in that case, whatever it may be, that becomes almost an irrelevant question in the end, that's not the right question to be asking. The right question is, there is only one of me, right? There is only one of me. And what does that really mean then? And how should I then how am I as a human being within that process? That's the focus. And out of that, then all sorts of things become possible out of that. That's what
And
happened to me.
And it really is the journey from being a
Yeah.
boy to a man or a girl to a
Yeah.
woman, because, for both genders, I mean, all of
Yeah.
us, for human
Yeah.
beings, just how can we grow into our skin and
That's
continue
right.
to respond in life with more love, with more compassion, with more
Yeah.
psychological maturity. So,
That's right.
this is the key.
And not acting out of fear within that. Right. I think, for a man especially, and that's all I can speak to, obviously. And even there, I'm only speaking about my own perspective. But for me as a man, what you just said, the growing out of the boy to the man, really meant understanding what in my decisions and who I was driven by fear. and understanding what those fears were, embracing some of them, discarding others, really just understanding it though, that's the difference between maturity and immaturity. Because then I'm making choices about how I choose to react to that fear versus just being purely reactive to the fear. And that then opens up all sorts of opportunities in terms of relationships and dating and even friendships along those lines. It just makes it completely different.
Amen, brother. And
Yeah.
because we both are celebrating such beautiful relationships and love affairs,
Yeah.
no, I can just say from my heart that I really want this for more people.
Oh, yeah. Oh, are you kidding? Absolutely. I know, right? I mean, what a wonderful world it would be if more people had this. And honestly, I know of only one other couple. You might be the second. I don't know you well enough to say, but I'll go with you on that. But my father and stepmother were the model for what we're talking about now. I mean, just that notion of always work, of always being with each other with their other person's best interest in mind, and knowing that that's the point that you begin with. That was magical.
It is such a path of generosity and
That's
growth
right.
and care and
Yeah,
compassion
that's
and
right.
it is, I think you and Don are speaking to this from my conversations with both of you. It can
Yeah,
be relatively easy. It doesn't mean
yeah,
there are
that's
challenges,
right.
but that's what I'm
That's right.
experiencing with Gavin. It's like we
That's
just love
right.
hanging out together. We're
That's
best
right.
friends.
That's right.
We have our own lives. We're sovereign individuals.
Yeah, that's right.
But
Exactly.
yeah,
Yeah,
there isn't a fight. There's just a coming together.
that's
Yeah.
right. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's the model we're talking about. So yeah, more of that. More people allowing that.
That's right. That's
Yeah.
right.
Okay.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Well, so we
Yeah.
send that out to whoever's listening.
That's if that's all we do today, Joy, that will be we will have accomplished the mission.
I think we've done much more. So thanks again, Eric. Really
Sure.
appreciate
It's been a pleasure talking with you. Thanks so much for the opportunity.